And now to 8 on your side special coverage from Cuba. It is a historic day in Cuba. Pope Francis in Havana meeting with the head of the Russian Orthodox Church. 8 on your side was there as Pope Francis was greeted by Raul Castro at the Havana airport. And News Channel 8's Jeff Patterson is the only Bay Area reporter in Havana this week.
Yes, a year ago, Jeff was there and talked to Tampa tour operator Steve Rupert. And today, Jeff spoke to Rupert in Havana about the changes happening there now.
Just 1 year ago, I was in Plaza Vieja and saw that they had done a lot of remodeling, spruced things up, made it look nicer. Well, the change has spread out from here. So how is it changing life for the average Cuban?
Whenever you have an economic expansion, there are some people that are rising with the tide and others aren't. The people that are directly involved in tourism, they're doing very well. People that are involved with tour guides or driving cars or renting their houses, they're doing very well. Everyone else, they're just sort of waiting. Now, eventually, when all that money comes into the economy, it's going to rise, it's going to lift all the boats.
The criticism, though, is that the money's just going to the government. Are you seeing that, or is the average Cuban benefiting from this?
If you're staying in a government hotel, the money's going to the government. If you're staying with me, it's going to the people that I live with. But the majority of the money that my people spend here directly to Cuban private entrepreneurs. And that's the one thing I'm seeing more than anything else. I'm seeing a rising entrepreneur class, which is what we would like to see, of course.
That's what Kathy Castor's coming here to see, is that rising entrepreneur class.
Oh, and it's happening. It's happening everywhere.
They've even added some unique art to the square since I was last here. Change isn't exactly happening overnight here, but it is happening. In Havana, Cuba, Jeff Patterson, News Channel 8.
And 8 on your side is the only TV station bringing you reports from Cuba on the delegation's trip. Jeff Patterson will continue to bring us stories from Havana all week long. He's there for an entire week. Coming up tonight at 11, we'll have more on the Pope's historic visit and
And now to 8 on your side, special coverage from Cuba as the U.S. considers lifting the Cuban embargo. Congresswoman Kathy Castor and a group of U.S. representatives left Tampa International Airport today for Havana. 8 on your side, Jeff Patterson, the only reporter there to cover that trip. And tonight, Jeff talked with the Congresswoman just after she arrived about what she and the other representatives are hoping to accomplish while there.
In just 1 year since I was in Havana, I'm seeing a lot of construction underway, electric lines being laid here, a hotel under construction behind me. There are tourists everywhere in Old Havana, and this is exactly what the U.S. congressional delegation has come here to see and to find out how it's all impacting the average Cuban.
I think you're right, Jeff. There is a lot happening here. Thousands and thousands of American tourists are here, in addition to Europeans and many others, and that's changing the face of Old Havana. I wonder what's happening further outside the city.
Congresswoman Kathy Castor is leading this group of U.S. representatives to see what life is like in Cuba today. They'll be seeing what a growing number of Americans are now experiencing as they can now travel to Cuba for the first time in decades.
I'd like to talk to the entrepreneurs and small business owners about their hopes.
Castro will be talking to small business owners like Hernan Garcia Gonzalez, who we met today in his Paladar, or private restaurant. Tell me about your business.
My business is a new business. Only 3 months I opened this business.
He has 10 employees working here, something he wouldn't have dreamed of until recently.
I always work to the government, you know, and now I have more work. It's more difficult, you know.
More work, also more opportunity. While they're here, Kathy Castor and the U.S. congressional delegation are even going to talk to some people about these beautiful cars to find out how they keep them on the road and to find out how they're profiting from American tourists coming to Cuba. In Havana, I'm Jeff Patterson, News Channel 8.
8 on your side is the only television station bringing you these reports from Cuba on this trip. Jeff Patterson will continue to bring us stories from Havana.
Tonight, Congresswoman Kathy Castor is in Havana with a delegation of U.S. congressional representatives. They're there to talk about trade opportunities and meet with Cubans to see what impact political change is having in the island nation. News Channel 8's Jeff Patterson is the only Bay Area reporter there to cover the visit. And tonight, Jeff joins us and shows us how some hardworking Cubans are already profiting from an increase in American visitors.
There are more than 200 professions in Cuba where the government licenses people to participate in a free and open economy. But there are some professions where enterprising Cubans are making money off of tourists under the table. In a small room in the back of his home, this man allowed us to record the time-honored way he supports his family. He tells me he makes 100 cigars a day and sells them all to tourists. This is not one of the licensed professions allowed by the government, but he manages to get his tobacco from outside of Havana to earn his living.
Hello, United States. Yeah, United States. Hello.
The Cuban people are happy to see an increasing number of Americans in their city. We found a group of men from Michigan who had just participated in a Miami to Havana sailboat race. Tell me what your impressions are just walking around the city for 2 days.
Well, you know, it's difficult to tell. That obviously things seem run down quite a bit and lack of maintenance, but the people are extraordinarily nice. They seem to like us.
Like other Americans we've met, they're fascinated by the car culture and the architecture of old Havana.
Seems like it's like a snapshot from my dad's time growing up. You know, it's like time just stopped here. Like the old cars, the old buildings, laundry hanging from the buildings.
Congresswoman Kathy Castor and her U.S. congressional delegation are here now to see what impact the Americans are having on the average Cuban and what impact political change has had in the last year.
Many in my delegation would like to lift the embargo. Some of the members of Congress are here to learn, to see if that's the appropriate policy choice for America.
6 congressional delegates here to find out more about the goings-on in Havana, Cuba, and we'll be here all week to cover what they're doing. In Havana, Jeff Patterson, News Channel 8.
An exciting week ahead. Thank you, Jeff. By the way, 8 on Your Side is the only television station bringing you reports from Cuba on this trip. You can watch more of Jeff's stories from Cuba this week, including tonight. Now to 8 on Your Side special coverage from Cuba as the U.S. considers lifting the Cuban embargo. U.S. Congresswoman Kathy Castor is in Havana this week looking at how political change is impacting that country. She's also looking at ways to expand business with Cuba under the current restrictions of the embargo. News Channel 8's Jeff Patterson is the only Bay Area reporter there to cover this visit, and tonight he spoke with Castor about some of the trade difficulties.
Here in Havana, we've seen cruise ships and cargo ships come in, but sending things here via ship is not easy for Americans, and that's one of the things Congresswoman Kathy Castor intends to look at while she's here.
Well, we're going to talk to officials, and we're going to go out to the port at Mariel, where the Brazilian government has invested a great deal, but we heard from Tampa business owners this morning before we left on how difficult it is to ship things into Cuba.
Castor and other congressional representatives have traveled here to examine U.S. and Cuban relations. But the trip is not without some criticism. As some people have pointed out to me on Twitter and Facebook, they're not happy about a U.S. congressional delegation traveling to Cuba to talk about lifting the embargo.
I hear a little bit of that, but after 50 years with an embargo in place that has done nothing but really hurt the Cuban people, hasn't changed the government, we need to try something new.
I am noticing a lot of change since I was in Havana just a year ago. There is new construction going on and more Americans. A new hotel is being built near Castle Moro on the Malecón. But Americans we met this week are still struck by how much work still needs to be done here.
Yeah, we spent quite a bit of time yesterday in old Havana. It's very old architecture, a lot of crumbling buildings, see a lot of places where it's shored up with 4x4s.
So the change isn't happening here overnight, but it is happening. In Havana, Cuba, Jeff Patterson, News Channel 8.
It's going to be an exciting week ahead. By the way, 8 on Your Side is the only television station bringing you reports from Cuba on this trip. You can watch more of Jeff's stories.
U.S. Congresswoman Kathy Castor is in Havana, Cuba this week, and so is News Channel 8. She's looking at how political change is impacting the country and for ways to expand business with Cuba. News Channel 8's Jeff Patterson is the only local reporter there. He shows us what's on the agenda for today.
It was a busy weekend for the U.S. congressional delegation led by Congresswoman Kathy Castor of Cuba. They met with a small businesswoman who makes baby clothes and is licensed by the government to do that. They also met with the man who keeps some of the beautiful Cuban cars on the road by servicing them in his garage. They wanted to talk with average Cubans to find out what impact the political changes are having on their lives. But today, the U.S. congressional delegation plans to meet with port officials to find out what are the obstacles in business between Tampa and Cuba and to find out what can be done to make those obstacles easier to get around. In Havana, Cuba, I'm Jeff Patterson, News Channel 8.
All right, thank you, Jeff. Your side is bringing you reports from Cuba all week. You can watch more on Cuba Stories from Cuba.
Now, 8 on your side's exclusive coverage from Cuba. We are the only television station following along with congressmen and women from the U.S. as they visit Havana. This is Jeff Patterson's 5th day in Cuba. And as Jeff shows us, change is happening rapidly between the U.S. and Cuba. The Obama administration approved an agreement today that will allow a U.S. factory in Cuba for the first time in more than 50 years.
News Channel 8's Jeff Patterson is in Havana and tells us about another agreement that will allow even more Americans to travel to Cuba.
The U.S. Secretary of Transportation will be here in Havana tomorrow to sign an agreement that will allow U.S. commercial airlines to travel here daily for the first time in decades. There are already many Americans that are here. The question is Cuba ready for more? We met a group of American teachers here from New York, and we asked them, what do they think? Why come now?
Well, we can. That's one reason.
Ellen Kingston came to Cuba with friends. She was last here 3 years ago. What changes have you noticed since 2013?
A lot more Americans, of course. And there were Europeans here then. And also construction. Like I see scaffolding. There are some billboards for new hotels coming. I don't know when they will be. It may be 10 years from now.
What are your observations about the buildings and the architecture?
Beautiful, but unfortunately dilapidated, falling apart.
Today, the U.S. congressional delegation, led by Congresswoman Kathy Castor, toured Old Havana. Several in this group favor lifting the embargo to move forward with the new U.S.-Cuba relationship.
But we, too, will get this embargo out of the way. And will Cuba be ready? These people are very well educated. If there's some of the restrictions that their government has placed on them are loosened, they'll respond.
The agreement that is scheduled to be signed tomorrow up to 20 U.S. flights to travel to Havana daily and up to 10 U.S. flights to travel to other cities from cities throughout the United States. Rapid change happening for a country that many say has been frozen in time since the 1950s. In Havana, Cuba, Jeff Patterson, News Channel 8.
8 on your side is the only television station bringing you reports from Cuba on this trip. Jeff Patterson will continue to bring those stories from Havana all week, including the U.S. congressional delegation in Havana's effort to lift the embargo completely. He'll explain what impact this could have coming up tonight. News Channel 8's Jeff Patterson is in Havana right now covering major changes to U.S. and Cuba relations. And tomorrow, the U.S. Secretary of Transportation will sign a new travel agreement with Cuba.
Jeff spent the past 5 days in Cuba, and tonight he has new details on lifting the embargo.
The U.S. Secretary of Transportation is scheduled to be here in Havana tomorrow to sign an agreement that will allow U.S. commercial airlines to operate here daily, allowing many more Americans to travel here from all over the United States. Today, the U.S. congressional delegation, led by Congresswoman Kathy Castor, toured Old Havana and talked about the changes that are happening now. Construction is going on. More Americans are coming. This country may not be completely ready if thousands more Americans come with new daily commercial flights.
They are ready from a culture, a spiritual, relationship based, but in terms of the sheer impact, I don't know that they can be ready for that.
Minnesota Congressman Tom Emmer co-sponsored a bill with Congresswoman Castor to lift the embargo. Several in this group are in favor of that major change. But more than 6,000 U.S. property claims have to be resolved before the embargo can be lifted. How do you reconcile that to move forward?
You work on it. You find the middle ground. You find the solutions.
Sarah Stevens is the executive director of the Center for Democracy in the Americas. She organized this congressional trip, and she believes the time for change is now.
I think everyone on both sides of the strait are tired of the status quo. It doesn't make any sense.
Big changes happening for a country that hasn't seen a lot of change since the 1950s. In Havana, Cuba, Jeff Patterson, News Channel 8.
8 on Your Side is the only television station bringing you reports from Cuba on this trip. Jeff Patterson will continue to have those stories from Havana all week. And now, 8 on Your Side's exclusive coverage from Cuba. Travel to Cuba may soon get a lot easier for Americans. Today, in an agreement, it was signed in Havana to allow daily commercial flights to Cuba for the first time in 50 years. News Channel 8's Jeff Patterson takes us inside the home of a woman who is benefiting from all of these changes.
It's been a historic day here in Cuba with the travel agreement being signed, and more Americans are arriving every day. They'll be able to see sites that Europeans have visited for years.
We're from England, Northamptonshire, a town called Kettering. We're on holiday.
Greg Jones and his wife came here on a cruise ship out of Jamaica. So what do you think of Cuba?
It's not what we expected, not really.
How so?
I don't know. It's a mixture of wealth and poverty.
But more Cubans are now earning an income here because the government has authorized more than 200 professions to be licensed here. We went to the home of Barbara and Michelle. She makes clothes in a small corner of her house. How does it help your family to have her do that?
Good. It helps good because the business has been grow up in.
And we're going to just sort of crowd in here.
Congresswoman Kathy Castor and her delegation visited the home to see how a change in U.S. relations with Cuba is impacting everyday citizens.
This is beautiful. But what Barbara demonstrates is that they're very resourceful. She has really worked to develop this small business, is now hiring employees. This was unheard of in Cuba a few years ago.
So there are many professions now benefiting from the increase in American visitors coming here. Everyone from a Coco taxi driver to the drivers of these classic American cars. Their income is increasing because of all of these American guests. In Havana, Cuba, Jeff Patterson, News Channel 8.
And News Channel 8 is the only television station covering the congressional delegation's trip to Cuba. Jeff will bring us another exclusive report tomorrow night. And now, 8 on Your Side's exclusive coverage from Cuba. As we reported yesterday, the U.S. has signed an agreement that will allow daily commercial flights to Cuba. U.S. airlines now have about 15 days to submit their applications for the routes to fly.
News Channel 8's Jeff Patterson is the only Bay Area reporter in Cuba covering this story. And tonight he looks at how daily flights will impact travel costs and where those flights might come from.
Cruise ships have been bringing European tourists to Cuba for years, but now U.S. travelers are rediscovering the history, art, and culture of this beautiful island nation. Americans are seemingly fascinated with Cuba. For years, it's been the forbidden fruit of Caribbean travel, and many want to come here before things change. What brought you to Cuba?
Just the interest of the people and just wanted to learn more about the culture.
Beth Wayne brought her daughter here from North Carolina. It's her second trip. Since you've been here before, what are you noticing about change?
A lot of Americans. Tons of difference. More building going on.
Steve Rupert has been bringing American tourists to Cuba for more than 20 years. He believes the agreement signed yesterday allowing daily commercial flights to Cuba will make it cheaper and easier to get here for many Americans. The question now, where will those flights come from? We talked about it while riding in the back of a '56 Pontiac. You know, they say they can fly from other markets in the United States. Where might that be?
Well, they'll certainly concentrate on Miami and Tampa, But some of the bigger cities in Chicago, Los Angeles, New York, Houston, those places will certainly have flights.
U.S. Airlines now have 15 days to submit their applications to make those daily flights to Cuba possible. In Havana, Cuba, Jeff Patterson, News Channel 8.
And Jeff will continue to bring us exclusive coverage from Cuba all this week. Tonight at 11, Jeff will take a closer look at the rebuilding efforts in that crumbling.
President Obama announcing that he'll visit the country next month. It will be the first time in more than 80 years a sitting U.S. president will visit the country. News Channel 8's Jeff Patterson is the only Bay Area reporter in Havana right now, and he shows us how all of this change could profit American companies.
From a distance, Cuba has incredible beauty, but just about every traveler that I've spoken to while I've been here notices one thing: Cuba's crumbling buildings.
Obviously, things seem run down quite a bit and lack of maintenance, but the people are extraordinarily nice.
A lot of crumbling buildings. See a lot of places where it's shored up with 4x4s.
What are your observations about the buildings and the architecture?
Beautiful, but unfortunately dilapidated, falling apart.
There are some other areas of old Havana that have already been restored. Plaza Viejo is one beautiful example of how things can look here. Steve Rupert has been bringing American tourists to Cuba for more than 20 years, and he sees opportunity here for American companies to take part in the rebuilding. We talked about it in the back of a '56 Pontiac while driving through some of Havana's old neighborhoods.
There's going to be a lot of people that are interested in getting a share of that market, because eventually this country, once the embargo is lifted, are going to get virtually all their building supplies from us.
So some may see only decay and ruin here, but others see opportunity in the very near future. In Havana, Cuba, Jeff Patterson, News Channel 8.
Next month, there will be even more reason for Americans to visit Cuba. The Tampa Bay Rays are scheduled to play against the Cuban national baseball team. There are also rumors that the Rolling Stones will be putting on a free concert there.
And now more exclusive coverage from Cuba. 8 on Your Side reporter Jeff Patterson has spent the past 7 days in Cuba. He was the only Bay Area reporter covering an important trip to Cuba by members of Congress. Well, looky here. Talk about a whirlwind trip. Jeff is back with us tonight in
Just got off the plane.
And actually, you got off the plane and you came home to some big news from the White House.
You know, I saw a lot while I was there, experienced history in the making while I was in Cuba. But today's announcement that a sitting U.S. president will be traveling to Cuba would have been unthinkable just a few years ago. While I was in Cuba, I found more Americans than I had seen on my last trip just 1 year ago. It's a country of contrast. We saw great beauty, and yet we saw buildings that are falling apart. Democratic Congresswoman Kathy Castor also just returned from Cuba and supports the president for going there.
I'm thrilled that President Obama and the First Lady are going to travel to Cuba next month.
For some, the news that President Obama will travel to Cuba is groundbreaking.
Without question, the most substantive development in 55 years.
Tampa attorney Al Fox has been to Cuba more than 100 times and is an outspoken opponent of the embargo.
The genie's now out of the bottle. In my opinion, it makes no difference who the next president is. They're not turning this back.
On the other side of the argument is Tampa attorney Ralph Fernandez.
This is a sad day for me.
Fernandez is a longtime anti-Castro force in Tampa, but he's also a lifelong Democrat who campaigned for President Obama. Fernandez is concerned about the impact that the president's visit to Cuba will have on the next election.
I think this fuels the fire of those Cuban Americans that do have money and do vote.
But Congresswoman Castor disagrees with Fernandez and believes the president will be able to press for the cause of human rights and other issues while he's there.
I think President Obama's visit will be a very important sign to the Cuban people there.
Castor told me today she is more committed than ever to lifting the embargo, and she believes it will happen this year because of all of the momentum that's going on.
Strong feelings on both sides with this. You see Marco Rubio and some others saying this is not the time. No sitting president should go to Cuba. And then you see what you saw. You saw a lot of change, the road construction, the building renovation, and the hope on the part of the people. Why do you think now is the time for President
Well, certainly the president is the driving force in this. He wants this to be part of his legacy, so he wants to make sure that he can do what he can while in office to have the embargo lifted. Part of it, he's at the end of his term, doesn't have to face re-election. The other part is polls now show that an overwhelming majority of Americans support lifting this embargo. They're tired of what's been going on the last 50 years. Kathy Castor said it today that the embargo is only hurting the people of Cuba right now. And we saw that because some of the living conditions there are deplorable. The buildings are falling apart, and it's because they just don't have the materials to rebuild. They don't have the infrastructure. They need a lot of help, and it can frankly be a lot of business for Tampa if that happens.
Well, a change is coming. No matter how it happens, change is going to happen. It's been a long time since I've been to Cuba. It's like 2006 in Guantanamo Bay.
I hear going back is going to be fun because the Rolling Stones will be there.
That's the rumor going. Thank you so much for your reports, Jeff. It's been fascinating. I always love the coverage, and you can count on us to continue to bring you complete coverage of President Obama's historic visit to Cuba. In fact, I'll be to Cuba in Havana following the president. Going to be there pretty much every step of the way, we hope. And again, that visit is scheduled for next month.
Now to our exclusive coverage from Cuba. News Channel 8's Jeff Patterson is now back after spending a week in Cuba. As the only Bay Area reporter there, Jeff was able to follow members of Congress on a fact-finding mission.
Yeah, what a time to be there. Jeff's trip came as President Barack Obama announced he would make a historic trip to Cuba himself. Well, we now know the president will visit March 21st and 22nd. Some Republicans are criticizing the president's decision, though, including our own Florida U.S. Senator and Republican presidential candidate Marco Rubio. However, our Congresswoman Kathy Castor, she's praising the president's decision.
When I hear naysayers like Senator Rubio and Senator Cruz say that they believe in the status quo, and that just says to me that they want to remain shackled to the Cold War policies of the past that have hurt Cuban families.
Well, President Obama's visit happens at the same time the Bay Rays are scheduled to play a game with the national baseball team in Cuba. That game's taking place March 22nd. And you can, of course, count on News Channel 8 to bring you complete coverage of the changes taking place in Cuba. That includes the visit by President Barack Obama, the first time a sitting U.S. president visits since 1928. Keith Kate will be in Havana before, during, and after the president's two-day tour. So you have to keep it right here for more reports from Cuba.
On your side, Jeff Patterson has just wrapped up a week-long trip to Cuba where he witnessed history in the making. A U.S. congressional delegation traveled to Havana to look at trade, travel, and issues related to the embargo. News Channel 8's Jeff Patterson joins us now live from Ybor City. And, Jeff, how did this trip go?
Yeah, very, very well. Good evening, Jen. You know, the Tampa Bay area has a long history with Cuba, but now some are starting to look at a new era in that relationship. In Cuba, we spent days on the streets of Havana, taking in the music and culture of this vibrant city. We also spoke to many Americans about why they are now coming to visit.
What would you say to others who want to come here?
You should do it. It's really cool.
It's just different. You know, everything in the United States is pretty cookie cutter. You come here and you feel like you're in a different time.
We went to Cuba to document the trip of U.S. Congresswoman Kathy Castor and a delegation of congressional representatives. Some of them are in favor of lifting the embargo.
For 40 years, I thought the American policy towards Cuba was foolish, and it has to change.
But they know it's a complicated process, as more than 6,000 U.S. claims exist because of property seized after the Cuban Revolution.
Those negotiations are ongoing, and they will get resolved.
While in Cuba, I felt a little like Forrest Gump, just a guy in the right place at the right time for history. Pope Francis arrived and walked with Raul Castro, just 10 feet from our camera, on his way to meet the head of the Russian Orthodox Church. And I was in the room when the agreement was signed, allowing daily commercial flights to return to Cuba for the first time in more than 50 years. You know how Forrest Gump just kept showing up in the picture with Richard Nixon and other people? That was me last week. U.S. airlines have about 2 weeks now to apply for these routes to make sure that they can get daily flights to Cuba from various cities across the United States. Jen?
Well, and Jeff, Tampa already has charter flights to Cuba. Will TIA be getting daily commercial flights to Cuba as well?
Yeah, I asked Kathy Castor about that yesterday. She is adamant that TIA Director Joe Lopano is on this. She says that he's very actively, aggressively trying to make sure that Tampa is one of those hub cities. He gets flights not only to Havana, but to other cities in Cuba. It really is starting a new era, Jen.
Jeff Patterson reporting live for us.
U.S. and Cuban relations continue to take major turns. Yesterday, the White House announcing that President Barack Obama will visit Cuba. And a day before that, a U.S. congressional delegation returned from Cuba following a meeting there about travel and trade opportunities. News Channel 8's Jeff Patterson was the only local reporter in Havana for those meetings, led by U.S. Congresswoman Kathy Castor, who tonight shares one of her favorite moments from the trip.
This is the image many Americans first notice when they arrive in Cuba, a country that appears frozen in time, with vintage American cars rolling down the streets. We explored a little deeper into the lives of everyday Cubans, finding a man who earns money by hand-rolling cigars at a small table in a corner of his cramped home. We were also there for one of Congresswoman Kathy Castor's favorite moments of her visit to Cuba. It happened in the home of Barbara Fernandez, a young Cuban woman who supports her family making baby clothes and shirts for men.
Barbara is remarkable. She reminds me of Sarah Blakely, who founded Spanx, who's from Clearwater. She has really worked to develop this small business.
Castor and the congressional delegation she led crowded into Barbara's small home to find out that not long ago, she earned a modest income working for the Cuban government.
Where she inserted medicine bottles into cardboard boxes for sale.
Now she's supporting herself and her family with her sewing.
And it's given her family money in their pocket to be able to buy a home. This is pretty unique in modern Cuba. Things are changing.
Congresswoman Castor told me she is now more committed than ever to lifting the embargo to help Barbara and her small but growing business. Jeff Patterson, News Channel 8.
The President and the Rolling Stones and the Tampa Bay Rays will all be in Cuba next month. It's going to be a big event, and you can count on News Channel 8 to bring you the complete coverage of the changes taking place in Cuba, and that includes President Barack Obama's historic visit. I plan to be in Havana next month before, during, and after